Foreign ministers from Denmark and Greenland have met with U.S. Vice President Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio at the White House. Denmark's Lökke Rasmussen and Greenland's Vivian Motzfeldt traveled to D.C. to discuss their concerns about the U.S. interest in acquiring or seizing Greenland. The Trump administration has insisted taking control of the Danish territory is necessary for U.S. national security. Both Greenland and Denmark say the island is not for sale. So why does the U.S. want Greenland so badly? And does Washington need to actually control the island to get what it wants?
This is Greenland. Just over 57,000 people living on over 2 million square kilometers. One of the least inhabited spaces on Earth. Home to huge deposits of rare earth metals. U.S. President Donald Trump says Russia and China want to take Greenland. And he's made no secret of his determination to acquire it first.
I would like to make a deal, the easy way, but if we don't do it the easy way, we're going to do it the hard way.
But the U.S. already has a military base in Greenland and a decades-old treaty that allows it to scale up its military presence whenever it wants. And NATO says it will take steps to beef up Arctic security. Greenlanders themselves are very much against a U.S. takeover. That would mean the U.S. would be ruling over a hostile population, which could make any kind of military or business deals complicated or even dangerous. Then there's the question of those vast mineral reserves. The U.S. wants to reduce its dependence on China, which controls many of the rare earth metals that are necessary for high-tech applications. But much of Greenland's reserves are north of the Arctic Circle, under sheets of ice more than a kilometer thick. Exploiting them is prohibitively expensive, one reason why global mining interests have not yet rushed in, despite Greenland courting foreign investment. It's much easier to mine this stuff elsewhere on the globe. Trump has talked about taking Greenland for years, suggesting there may be a different agenda. He told the New York Times why he wanted the U.S. to own it. That's what I feel is psychologically needed for success, he said. I think that ownership gives you a thing that you can't do whether you're talking about a lease or a treaty. Ownership gives you things and elements you just can't get from signing a document. Trump's ambitions have Greenland's and European leaders on edge. Seizing territory from NATO ally Denmark could break up the alliance, with Trump seemingly emboldened to act without restraint or concern for how China and Russia could exploit a fractured NATO.
For more, we're joined now by Elisabeth Braw from the Atlantic Council's Transatlantic Security Initiative. Welcome back to DW. Now, the reasons Trump gives for wanting to control Greenland are highly questionable. We heard it there. What is this really about?
It seems to be that President Trump has seen the landmass of Greenland. This is what the New York Times has reported. He saw the landmass of Greenland on a map and decided that that would be a territory that should belong to the United States. What he has said in his various statements about Greenland over the years is that Denmark is not taking care of Greenland, that Greenland would be better off belonging to the United States, or that Russia and China are trying to encircle it. But none of those reasons really add up to the reality. So it seems to be a fixed idea that he has and is now trying to implement.
There were high-level talks on the matter today in Washington. You say it's a fixed idea he has. Which course of action do you believe the U.S. will be most likely to pursue here then?
It was an extraordinary moment today. I don't think we have seen anything like it in a number of years of diplomacy, possibly decades of diplomacy. The foreign minister of Denmark and a Greenlandic government representative traveling to Washington to have this meeting, first originally with Marco Rubio, then Vance decided to also join the meeting, and the stakes were enormous. And I don't envy the foreign minister of Denmark, who had to walk into this meeting knowing that the Americans have designs on Greenland, nor do I envy the the Greenlandic government representative. But according to Danish media, the meeting went well insofar as one can tell, because the Danish foreign minister seemed relieved afterwards. We don't know what was said in this meeting, but it is extraordinary that it even had to take place, and that it had to take place under such conditions.
Mm-hmm. Any sense of what the U.S. might do next? Because this was a meeting, of course, between Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, and the Danish and Greenlandic representatives, but then Donald Trump might have something else in mind.
He might, and that is the challenge with the world as it is today, that yes, you can have diplomatic meetings, yes, you can negotiate, yes, you can agree on things, but at the end of the day, what matters, as President Trump himself has said many times, what matters at the end of the day is his position. That is what he has said about the Ukraine peace negotiations and many other negotiations. So we don't know yet what was decided in the meeting today, but if Trump decides that he wants to pursue a different course from what Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance may have suggested in that meeting, then that's what will happen. And that, of course, puts Denmark in a difficult position once again, together with the rest of the EU, the rest of the European part of NATO.
Denmark announced just today that it was ramping up its military presence in Greenland in coordination with NATO allies, that is. Does that include the U.S. right now? And what should we make of this move?
Once again, we are experiencing historic developments. Denmark has been ramping up its military presence on Greenland, and just today, Sweden announced that it's sending officers to Greenland. Norway has just announced the same thing, and other European countries are also sending troops to Greenland. The Danish defense minister announced today. And ordinarily, we would think that this is in response to a threat from Russia or China. Now, we don't know anything other than the fact that they will be participating in an extended exercise at the invitation of Denmark. It is really historic, extraordinary moments we are living through, and it is worth reminding ourselves that a year ago, a month ago, 2 months ago, we would have thought that Russia was the main adversary in the Arctic. Now, European countries are doing what they can to support Denmark in this crisis, and these dealings with the United States have turned out to be even more urgent than interactions with Russia.
An unprecedented situation indeed. That was Elisabeth Braw of the Atlantic Council's Transatlantic Security Initiative. Thanks so much for all your insights. Now, France's President Emmanuel Macron has said that if the sovereignty of a European country and ally were affected, the ramifications would be unprecedented. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is pledging EU support for Greenland and Denmark's right to decide their own future.
Greenland belongs to its people. So it's up to Denmark and Greenland, and only to them, to decide on matters that are concerning Denmark and Greenland. And for me, it's important that the Greenlanders know, and they know this by the deeds, not only by the words, that we respect the wishes of the Greenlanders and their interests, and that they can count on us.
The EU vowing to respect the wishes of Greenlanders, and they have been very clear they do not want to become part of the United States. To convey that message, the foreign ministers of Denmark and Greenland traveled to Washington today. Let's talk about this meeting and the unprecedented situation that triggered it with Rasmus Soendergaard. He's a senior researcher on foreign policy and diplomacy at the Danish Institute for International Studies. Rasmus, welcome to DW. Now, just before this meeting, Donald Trump upped the ante by posting on social media that anything less than U.S. control of Greenland was unacceptable. He insists the U.S. needs Greenland for national security. How much truth is there to that?
Not very much, I'm afraid. So the reality is this. There is a defense agreement between Denmark, Greenland, and the United States, which gives the United States virtually unlimited access to the territory of Greenland, where the U.S. can build and expand as many military bases or radar systems as they would like. Trump is correct, though, to say that the US has, for a long time, neglected Greenlandic security, although he blames that on Denmark. The reality is the US used to have multiple military bases and upwards of 15,000 troops in Greenland. Today, the US have 150 troops in one military base. So there is ample room for enhancing the US military presence. And on that, the US is correct that there is a need to strengthen security in the Arctic, not least because there is an increased Russian and Chinese activity, not around Greenland, but in the Russian part of the Arctic.
The Danish and Greenlandic foreign ministers are in Washington today for talks with the U.S. Vice President and the Secretary of State. How important is it that Denmark and Greenland present a united front here?
It's paramount that Denmark and Greenland stand shoulder by shoulder. We heard the message before the meeting from the leader of the Greenlandic government, as well as the Danish Prime Minister, that the goal of this meeting was to walk in together, sit together, and walk out together. And that's exactly what has happened. And right now, we see the press briefing with the Danish Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Greenlandic Minister of Foreign Affairs. And so far, what we've heard is that they agreed to disagree with the United States as to whether Greenland needs to become part of the United States. However, they also agreed to continue the dialogue, and that has been the objective for Denmark and Greenland, to open up formal diplomatic dialogue behind closed doors and try to get this conversation away from social media and the media and into the sort of more traditional diplomatic channels.
But it's a very unsatisfying outcome, isn't it? Greenland doesn't want to be bought, and it certainly doesn't want to be invaded. Military access and access to natural resources are already possible for the U.S. So why this disagreement, and how can the three actors involved here move on?
The short answer, we don't know if they can. They've agreed to continue talking, and viewed from the Danish and Greenlandic perspective, that is positive, because we only really see a viable diplomatic solution, not a military one. However, we don't know if it's possible to reach some form of compromise. As long as President Trump insists on taking Greenland one way or another, and thereby violating their sovereignty, there is no path for Denmark and Greenland to continue negotiations. However, if the US is willing to talk about shared responsibility for addressing legitimate security concerns in the Arctic, then Greenland and Denmark are more than happy to continue. And so I view the announcement that there will be continued talks as an indication that the US is at least willing to listen to Greenland and Denmark and continue talking about potential shared efforts within the NATO framework. However, I'm fully aware that Trump has not given up on his primary objective, which is to expand US territory to include Greenland.
Denmark has announced it's increasing its military presence in Greenland. This is tied to military exercises in cooperation with NATO allies. They're being joined by personnel from other NATO countries. Help us understand this. Is this a move to appease or to deter the US?
It's a really good question because, officially, this is a move to appease the United States. This is a move by NATO countries in Europe to address the security concerns that Donald Trump has pointed out, to increase NATO's security presence in Greenland as a way of keeping Russian and Chinese influence out. However, it's likely to say that it might also serve another purpose that's more imminent, and that is, of course, to deter any sort of US military aggression. So basically, what we're seeing is that by the request of Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, European NATO countries are upping the ante here. By putting more European troops in Greenland, they are potentially raising the bar for what Trump would have to do if he were to use military force.
The Danish government does acknowledge, and you said so as well at the beginning of our talk, that there are weak spots in the Arctic. What would NATO have to do to credibly face these threats that are, I'm assuming, only going to increase with time?
So the threats, it's important to say, are not some form of Russian or Chinese invasion of this massive landmass of ice with very little a small population living on it. The threat is not being aware of any potential hostile activities by the Russians or the Chinese. So the first thing that NATO ought to do, the US, NATO, Denmark, is to put up more radar systems and other capabilities, drones and so on, that could help increase NATO's situational awareness. So we have a better sense of what is going on, because that is the legitimate criticism at the moment. We do not have sufficient knowledge about the whereabouts of potential hostile actors in the region. So that's what's at stake. And then, of course, Donald Trump has also mentioned that he would like to see Greenland included in a future Golden Dome, as he calls it, an anti-missile system similar to the one Israel has as the Iron Dome.
The Danish Prime Minister has said that any U.S. military intervention in Greenland would be the end of NATO. Why are Trump and his inner circle, who might be a little more fond of NATO than the president himself, why are they causing such an unprovoked crisis in an already strained alliance at a moment where NATO is struggling really to project strength and unity?
Again, a very good very good question. I mean, NATO maybe should have other issues they should focus on, and other aggressive actors they should focus on deterring. I can only speculate that the reason why Trump is willing to risk further fracture in the transatlantic alliance and the relationship to Europe is because he prioritizes control over Greenland. He views Greenland as sort of the missing piece in his sort of claim to dominate the Western Hemisphere under the so-called Monroe Doctrine. And so I think for President Trump personally, he is willing to risk more issues with the Europeans, potentially fracturing NATO for the price of acquiring Greenland. And again, I think it goes to his own personal ego. I'm convinced that he would like to be the president to expand US territory. He said as much himself. That is psychological for him. He told the New York Times to control Greenland because he believes that it's better to control than to work through alliances. And he's, I think, determined to build into his own legacy as he's like to be the next president to expand US territory.
Donald Trump is, of course, known to be very unpredictable, but I'm still going to ask you to try and predict his next move here.
Well, I think now we hear from the press briefing following the meeting between Vice President Vance, Secretary of State Rubio, and their Danish and Greenland counterparts that we will have continued diplomatic engagement. There'll be a working group, and so this track of diplomacy will continue. As to what Trump might do, it's anyone's guess. And we saw the White House put out a post on social media during the meeting with a picture of two dog sleds, one leading to Greenland being American under nice weather and beautiful golden future, and one dog sled leading another way to a Russia-Chinese occupied nightmare scenario for Greenland. So he is still very much in that line of communication, and he could anytime come out and reiterate his demand to have control over Greenland. So we're not out of the woods in this by any means. I think we're likely to see this whole thing continue. And again, speculating on what Trump would do next is almost a bit of a fool's errand. Anything is still on the table.
This is Rasmus Soendergaard of the Danish Institute for International Studies. Thank you so much for your time and all those insights.
Thank you.